Hello everyone, welcome back to iGaming Daily. I'm Ted Orme-Claye. I'm joined here with Ted Menmuir yet again, second day in a row. We're back in the studio. Of course, the podcast is sponsored by Optimove, number one CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market. We're going to hand over to our colleague Viktor later on, who did an interview with Pontus Lindwall, the CEO of Betsson AB, earlier today, about their Q1 financial results, which were just published this morning. But before we get into Viktor's interview, Ted and I are just going to have a bit of a chat about these results and the wider market and circumstances for some of Europe's biggest gambling PLCs, I guess. So yeah, Ted, you're ever the expert, ever the analyst on these sort of things. What do you think so far from these results? What are some of the big talking points you reckon for Betsson and other big gaming PLCs at the moment?
Okay, should we start with? I think Entain kind of overshadowed this morning.
Yeah, I mean, Entain are obviously second biggest gambling group in the world after Flutter, right? Usually by revenue, yeah. So they are the big one, yeah.
So they announced the appointment of Stella David as permanent CEO, transitioning from interim. Were we surprised? Not really. I think that this kind of points towards a more strategically stable Entain in terms of what has to be done and what has to be done to kind of confound the relations with investors and project kind of a clearer strategic view of where the company's going to. But it has a long road ahead, and it definitely has kind of headwinds incoming with the FCA's challenge in the UK and the Austrac settlement yet to be decided in Australia. So as ever, Entain are, they're a moving vehicle, and it's hard to project where they'll be at the end of the year. But, things are developing there.
Yeah, Entain's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, first I think a good point made there was relations of stakeholders and investors, wasn't it? Because I think there's been some reports in UK media lately, I think on Sky News, I believe it was, that apparently some investors have been calling for her to be instated on a permanent basis lately. There seems to have been some demand there, perhaps for a bit more stable leadership. Like you said, a confirmation of strategic direction with a permanent CEO at the helm. I think Entain's obviously, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Kind of, again, for the same reasons you mentioned, of like they consistently perform well on a revenue basis, and it's easy to see why with such a strong portfolio of brands that they've got. Ladbrokes, Coral, bwin, so on. You mentioned Australia. Obviously, they're one of the biggest ones there of Ladbrokes, Australia, and Neds. But then, kind of from a regulatory and governance standpoint, as you mentioned, that's where they come up with the hurdles, isn't it? So in terms of like trading and brands, they do really well, but they're just coming up against a lot of these regulatory challenges and headwinds, like with the Austrac investigation, with the situation with the FCA in the UK and that old HMRC settlement from a year or so ago. So like it's a very interesting company to follow in that regard.
A lot of drama.
Yeah, a lot of drama.
What great insight. But look, I think, we've got to step back a bit. We're still kind of very early into our Q1 calls across the PLCs. But I think kind of updates from Entain and Betsson, I think one thing that it's telling us is that across the board, there needs to be kind of stability, and there's a lot of pressure on leadership to get things right in what's going to be a difficult H2 for all PLCs. And, we live in uncertain times, so the macroeconomic picture is looking very blurred out there, especially in North America and Europe. And also there's a heck of a lot of regulatory headwinds coming in Latin America. Markets where they've invested kind of multi-million, not only in Brazil, but Colombia. We're going to see kind of that VAT. I think the VAT increased to 19%. So how that plays out. I think this is going to be a year that really tests leadership. And I think from an investor view, you're looking, if you're not sorted at the top table, it's going to be quite frantic for them. And I think that a lot of the players that you're going to see now are just to settle kind of the, your corporations for for kind of messy affairs or messy headwinds coming in from H2 onwards.
Betsson kind of noted this in their Q1 report as well, didn't they? I mean, they've the statement in that from Pontus Lindwall, which will be discussed, I think, later on by Viktor. Anyway, he mentioned like the macroeconomic headwinds that are going on, the really difficult trading circumstances that companies, not just gambling companies, but businesses in general, like you said, in Europe and America, are facing with tariffs and trade wars and sluggish economic growth. Things are difficult. Obviously, they've recorded revenue gains against that, but the economic circumstances these companies and all of us as consumers find ourselves working in are difficult. And then, like you said as well, the Latin America side of things. I mean, I think Betsson are quite an interesting company in Latin America from what I've read and from when I spoke with Jesper Svensson at ICE earlier this year. Kind of their approach to Latin America of it being very diversified is interesting, kind of spreading their bets, I guess you could say, if you want to forgive me for that pun. In Latin America, like not just focusing on Brazil, like which has obviously got a lot of hype around it at the moment. They're active in Argentina, like you say. I think they've just been building up in Paraguay as well. But a lot of these markets have got some tough regulatory changes incoming, particularly around tax. So there's a lot of prospects, but also a lot of challenges that are just coming hand in hand with each other. Is that something you'd agree with? Yeah,
look, I mean, I'd rather be in Betsson's position where they sign a resilient kind of Q1 than heading into the kind of headwinds that everyone's going to have to tackle with. And then remember, this is gaming, and a lot of kind of results, regardless of what's going on in the world, come down to whether conditions are favorable to your business. I think we have to this is one of the few times where gaming has to kind of look outside of its remit, and it is an uncertain time across all industries. But I think the bigger picture, it's like, how does kind of gaming recapitalize or kind of recalibrate to new conditions, right? And whether by kind of Q3, it is still carries its appeal to kind of wider investors and wider institutional investors willing to, willing to back the sector. There's everything to play for here. And actually, I think that in kind of these kind of rupturous times, you might see one or two kind of clever moves from companies that benefit from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I think you've hit the nail on the head there with that one, Ted, of looking ahead to what the rest of the year will be like. It'll certainly be an interesting one to keep an eye on. There's a huge amount of factors at play, different regulatory changes and challenges, changes to tax regimes, just the general squeeze that consumers and businesses are finding themselves in these quite challenging economic times. Who knows where it could go. It's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. Anyway, I think on that note, it's probably about time for us to hand over to Viktor and his interview with Pontus Lindwall, Betsson AB CEO, where he'll be discussing a lot of these factors we've just discussed. I think, as well as something that Betsson mentioned quite a lot in their Q1 was like a focus on technological investment and things like that. So I think we'll hopefully hear a few insights into that as well when Viktor speaks with the CEO. So thanks very much for joining me, Ted, to have a quick breakdown of these PLC results. And to our listeners, please enjoy the interview with Pontus Lindwall. See you next time.
I'm Viktor Kayed, senior journalist for SBC News, and today I'm joined by Pontus Lindwall, CEO and president of Betsson, to discuss the company's latest results. Pontus, once again, thank you for joining me today, as always. I'm not going to waste your time anymore. I'm going to head straight into the questions. The first thing I want to ask is that we've seen Betsson achieve a strong sportsbook margin in this quarter. Given this factor, do you think, are there any plans to introduce more niche sports betting options, such as esports, local sports, etc.?
Yeah, we have them all, actually. We have a lot of niche offerings in our sportsbook as well, such as esports, music competitions, political, elections and things like that. But still, it doesn't account for the larger part of our revenues, but you can find everything in there.
All right. And you also have a strong cash position. How does Betsson plan to use this for the acquisitions or tech investments or business diversification?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's actually the first time I get it today, which surprises me a bit because it's a very strong cash position that we have. And we usually get that question. And the answer is that M&A is a big part of our growth strategy, but M&A doesn't happen on a weekly or monthly basis. It happens when it happens, when we get a good opportunity. So I think we can say that we are well geared up to do M&A, but we're not going to run ahead and just buy anything. We will wait for good opportunities, and I think I can say that being the CEO of the company, it's a nice problem to have, that you have a cash box full of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And focusing more on the product side of the company, are there any plans to leverage AI further for dynamic personalization of gaming content for individual customers?
Yeah, we will see. We use AI in certain aspects of our offering already, such as in the customer support and in, also player detection tools and things like that. We use it also in product development in certain aspects, and I'm sure we're going to implement it in other areas as well going forward. So we have a separate unit that looks into that and works with that on a daily basis. So I'm sure we're going to move on to broader use of AI in our business.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of innovation, I don't think I saw this mentioned in your report, but in terms of crypto and blockchain-based payments, is Betsson looking at implementing similar products in the near future to enhance customer acquisition?
Yeah, this is something that we look into as well. And we are, as we speak, working actively on looking into the possibilities to utilize that as ways of payment for our business.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. And so far, we're talking about product and business growth. Now I'm gonna switch gears into region-specific questions, specifically around Latin America. So my first question there is, how does Betsson plan to manage regulatory risks as it expands further into Latin America?
Yeah, regulatory risks is something that we see in all markets where we operate, and it's something that is outside of our control, essentially. We cannot decide what the regulators, in which ways they want to move, or what kind of, potential limitations they want to put on the products. But what we can do is to try to inform politicians and educate politicians about and regulators about the consequences of certain measures when it comes to tax levels and limitations in the product. And I think that has been one of the most important discussions that has been going on in trade media for the gaming industry for the past few years, and where we have seen that many countries has actually failed with their gaming regulation because they have been too harsh in the way they have formed the regulations, which as a result puts the players outside of the regulation. So going back to your question about if there is a regulatory risk in LATAM, yes, there is always a regulatory risk in all regulated gaming industry, and we just need to live with it. We need to stay close to the regulators. And of course, one of the most important things we need to do is to explain to the regulator that we are on the same team here, because you want a regulated industry. We want to be in the regulated industry. So we have the same common interest, and that is to make the regulated part of this industry successful.
Right. And speaking of stricter regulations, how do you think Betsson can handle potential tightening of gambling advertisements across not only Latin America, but Europe as well? For example, in Brazil, we see that they are currently debating should gambling advertisements be completely banned, or should only celebrities be excluded from participating? But the blanket ban is on the agenda. So how does Betsson intend to handle potential tightening around gambling advertising rules?
It's the same thing as I spoke about with all the limitations within regulations that, you know, if we are regulated, that means that we are, you know, supposed to be acting in a certain jurisdiction, as an example, with our products. And then it's, you know, important that we get the possibility to tell the end user that we exist. So it's not a sustainable way to create the gaming regulation, which doesn't allow the operators to market themselves or communicate to the market. So again, there is this element of education that we need to do towards the politicians. And of course, we can discuss with politicians how to form some kind of, you know, caps or levels on what you can do and what you can't do. But we need to be able to communicate to the clients.
Mm-hmm. And again, on Brazil specifically, feel free to leave this blank. But we're hearing talks that companies that are currently regulated in the new market might have to pay taxes all the way back to 2018, 2019, correct me if I'm wrong, but for a long period of time. Do you have any comments on that specific development, and how does Betsson plan to assess the risks around that?
I don't have any comments on that very market and what's being discussed there.
Okay. We'll leave it at that then. And the final question, what investments is Betsson making to improve the mobile user experience given the expansion of that vertical, particularly in newly regulated markets?
Yeah, we invest a lot in building our native apps, and the mobile offering that we have, that stems for the major part of our revenues. And as we mentioned in the report, we have increased the number of people on the tech side in the company, employing more and more people, and that is to make sure that we stay in the forefront with the product. And it's actually not easy, because we are now operational in 25 regulated different jurisdictions. Every single one of these jurisdictions has different regulations. They allow different kind of games and things. So it's actually 25 different products that we have to build. Of course, they share components to a large extent, but it's a big operation. So we invest a lot in product development, and we take those investments over the P&L as a cost, because it's salary cost. So that's different from like normal industry companies. When they make an investment in a factory or a machine, it goes on the balance sheet and it gets depreciated over 10, 20 years maybe. But we invest on a daily basis in product development and marketing over the P&L.
Mm-hmm. Okay. With that, we're going to wrap it up. I know you're busy, so I'm not going to take more of your time. As always, thank you for joining us, Pontus. We're looking forward to speaking again, hopefully soon. And thanks for everyone listening, for tuning in to today's episode. I was Viktor Kayed. See you in the next one.